Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Building Equitable Practices and Programs, a conversation with energy equity leaders. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're very excited to have some incredible guest speakers with us today. Before we pass it over to them, I'd like to go over some webinar logistics. If you'd like to minimize the webinar viewing panel, you can do so by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on the orange arrow to expand your webinar console. There are no slide presentations in today's webinar. The panelists will be having a moderated discussion. So we do encourage you to submit your questions via the webinar console throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to save time at the end for a Q&A with the audience, but we plan to spend the majority of our time answering questions that were previously submitted. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you via email within 48 hours. You can also find all of these materials posted on our website at cisa.org/webinars. This is also where we post all of our upcoming webinars and all of our archived webinars. With that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, my colleague, Anna Ziai.
Thank you, Zareen. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Ziai, and I'm the Project Director for State Implementation of Federal Climate Legislation at CISA. CISA is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. We work with state leaders, federal agencies, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to develop clean energy programs and inclusive renewable energy markets. Our members are mostly state agencies, and they include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives in the country. And you can see some of their logos on the next slide here. All right, so this is also part of CISA and CISA's IRA and BIL initiative, which I help lead, and it provides tailored support to states to navigate Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law opportunities, and you can find more information about this initiative on our website. Next slide, please. This webinar is being held in conjunction with a summit that we are holding with the U.S. Department of Energy to support states with IRA and BIL implementation, and it's going to take place on April 17th and 18th in Washington, D.C. So our conversation today is intended to provide a through line for discussions at each of the sessions at the summit, and we hope you find it helpful as you build equity into your programs and practices for your communities. And if you're a state and federal government employee and you haven't registered for the summit, you can still do so, and we'll put the link in the chat so that you'll be able to go to the website and access it. All right, today I have the pleasure of joining three incredible energy equity experts to discuss this topic. We have Quinn Parker, who is the founder and CEO of Encolor, Damali Harding, who's the principal and U.S. program director at the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, and Pamela Fann, the founder and CEO of Integrated Solutions and the co-owner and principal of Impact Energy. So we're going to attach their bios as a handout in the webinar console for you each to read about, and that way we also can dedicate more of our time to our discussion and the many, many questions that our attendees sent in beforehand. We want to make sure that we have time to address them. So let's get started. All right, my fellow panelists, there's been a lot of discussion as we've been diving into these programs and creating different policies and programs in our communities around community benefits, and that's such a large umbrella term. Can you guys provide some examples of community benefits that have really worked for the community? So what does that mean to you in the course of your work?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Thank you, Anna. For me, it means coming up with a holistic plan that's going to include jobs as some sort of benefit to the community, that is going to include any kind of remediation of issues that's happening within the community. So if you have a community that's experiencing flooding and they're in a flood zone, that whatever type of project or kind of work that you're doing with that and within that community also helps to remediate some of those and mitigate some of those climate problems that they have. And it includes thinking about the community in the terms of how do we uplift them? How do we uplift them? How do we empower them? How do we look at economic advancement for them? So health impacts for them. So it really does include a lot when you're talking about benefits, like what way is this going to benefit the community, depending on the project that it is. And so, yeah, I like to take it as a holistic approach and think of many different things, but it should always be inclusive of economic vitality and health impact.
Thank you.
Yeah, and when I think about benefits for community, obviously all the things that Pam just mentioned, but being very intentional on including community in that conversation. We all have ideas about what community benefits should be, how we think the community can benefit from different clean energy projects, but oftentimes the community doesn't necessarily have the same expectations or what they think is important to them. I think in general, we need to make sure that the community is represented in these conversations so we can build plans that actually are socially valid to them and provide the benefits that they're looking for.
Thank you.
And I think I would echo those same responses and just reminders that we are all the community, right? And so as we think about the benefits to everyone, what are the benefits of making sure that people have access to energy that is clean, that is affordable, where even just the stress of not having to worry about energy burdens as we move towards a much faster digital age. You know, every child now gets a Chromebook, at least at some part of school. What does that mean for access and the ability to even do things as simple as apply to some of these programs, right? Having the ability to have access to electricity at home, to apply for school, to apply for enrollment in programs is something that we can sometimes take for granted. And so remembering that access and those outcomes we're looking for are really about quality of life and improvement.
That's great. Thank you. And I think one of the benefits that one of our audience members asked about is in the context of ownership. And they asked, how do others help the community by allowing for community ownership of things like completed solar projects?
Can you say that question more time?
I will.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
okay.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
How do others help the community, so I guess other stakeholders at large, by allowing for community ownership of completed solar projects? So maybe you can speak a bit to the benefits, the community benefits of having ownership into these projects.
I mean, I think fundamentally the first benefit is the financial incentive, right? The ownership of the ability to, one, reduce your electricity bill. So there's financial incentives in a couple of different ways. So one, the ability to utilize electricity and reduce your energy burden is an immediate response. The second is, you know, if you can design the program so that there's an ability to sell the excess. And so now that you have a producing asset that the community can then also take advantage of, right? And so thinking through the infrastructure and that support, but just, you know, baseline, there's a great financial incentive for communities.
Great. All right.
I agree with that. And I'll just add to that, you know, any kind of ownership, when you're thinking about communities, in particular disadvantaged ones, owning of any kind of property, owning of homes, owning of a solar system within the community, being able to sell it back, owning of EV charging infrastructure, and being able to get, whether, I mean, we know it's a small amount, but any kind of ownership that draws back to the economic building of a community is what's vital. And that's a big part of this energy system that these communities have not had, and that what's been missing. So it's super important as you're thinking through like what that looks like and what it could look like, that you're going in with those solutions as well and talking about it. Unfortunately, sometimes, you know, we do know of some utilities that don't want to see the community own it, because then they think that that may take away from profits that they should be getting. But if we're thinking about this again in a benefit way of a community, then we have to really think about what does that look like, and if we're doing the best thing that's for the community as well.
I think, and I just to kind of put a cap on this too, a lot of times community want to have some ownership in these projects, but legislative kind of barriers, systemic challenges in the way they can engage with community, even utility regulation that makes it very difficult for them to work with community are a barrier in itself. So I think as we talk about community ownership, we also have to talk about some of the like institutional, systemic inequities in our processes that aren't allowing community to truly engage and own some of this infrastructure. So it's not just a desire for community to own energy projects. We have to remove some of the barriers for community ownership of energy.
That's great. And I'm also thinking about this now in the context of building generational wealth. And so there's different types of wealth. And so I want to hear if you guys have insights about what that different wealth building in the communities over generations can look like in the context of benefits.
I always think about when this comes up, it's not just the dollars, right? Like, absolutely, let's put dollars in households so that families can build wealth they pass down to their children and great-grandchildren, property, assets. But it's also knowledge. You know, I didn't have a family that could teach me how to own a business. I didn't know the first thing about entrepreneurship. Passing that type of education down through communities so that they can build for themselves is invaluable. So I think the dollars are important, but also growing capacity, educating, making sure folks have the right resources so that they can build wealth is also important.
And creating that legacy, right? Creating a legacy for your family, for your children and grandchildren, great grands, as Quinn mentioned. But you know, jobs don't make us wealthy. We get wealthy from property and ownership and from entrepreneurship. That's how we become or start building that legacy of wealth within our communities. So I know we're going to talk about a little bit this later, but you know, legacy home owning in communities that we're really doing great innovative projects and you know, ensuring that those communities are also secure, that they're able to continue to keep their legacy properties is also very important, because we're seeing that happen a lot. But yes, that's how you that's, you know, the way to gain wealth here in America is through ownership of things. Those are your assets. So, you know, and it really makes a lot of sense to ensure that as we're thinking about these bipartisan infrastructure laws and the funding, that we're putting mechanisms in place that also support, again, that economic growth and the economic stability of these communities as well.
And I think the going back to what Pam and Quinn said, both the procedural access, right? So once you have ownership in fundamentally utility infrastructure, and I'm using the word utility very broadly, you then now have, in some ways, required commitment to getting your voice heard as policy changes happen, as the infrastructures continue to be built out. You now have to be consulted. You now have to be informed. So I think some of the challenges that we have seen in communities where they're informed or consulted too late to have a voice to say, wait a minute, we're not sure we want this. You are now leaving that legacy to your children and your grandchildren, where because you have this producing asset there is a procedural requirement to engage you. And I think that is one of the things that we keep hearing from communities, is that they want to understand when they should get engaged, because these assets, regardless if it's community owned or not, they're in the ground for tens, if not hundreds of years, right? Like once you put a solar farm somewhere, it's very hard to move that farm. Once you put, and we've seen that with the coal plants, we've seen that with gas plants, like those aren't moving, right? In some cases, they may be shutting down, but people don't just pick something up and say, oops, we made a mistake and put it in this community. And so that requirement now, when you own something, to be consulted is super beneficial and helpful.
Thank you. So I'm thinking now about effective engagement with communities as states and local partners build out their programs and their policies. And it's so important, of course, to identify who the trusted partners are in your state. You can't go at it alone if you don't have those connections or if you've ruined trust in the past. So how, in your opinion, can states identify who these trusted partners are, depending on where they are? Because it may not be a national approach.
I guess I'll start that one. There are numerous frameworks and papers. I think all of us on this call have either written or contributed to a paper on engaging communities multiple times. So I think one, just doing your basic research of what does that mean. Second, when we think about the framework for energy equity, it's the identification piece, right? Who is your community? Is your community rural, right? I was reading a article this morning about how do you define rural communities? What does that mean? Population, density, distance from services. But that identification of who your community is, and what does that mean in your particular area? And even within a state, that may look different, right? You have urban rural divide, you have indigenous lands in some states that take up, a significant portion of the state. And then second is making sure you understand what so I think it's listening in a they want a meaningful way, and then holding yourself accountable. It's accountable for what you heard. So if you heard that they want ownership, you have an obligation now to go back and close that loop around what policies, what procedures, what needs to happen in order for that to happen.
I would say engagement for me is really it's on the ground. I'm an on the ground engager. I go into the community and actually face them head on and help them think through solutions for all the issues that they have. I might be going into a community to do a clean transportation plan, but I'm leaving out of there connecting with cities about streetlights or the crosswalk or the sidewalks. Or the fact that there's not enough trees lined on the sidewalk. So while I may have an idea of what it is, what it actually is sometimes and most times very different. My suggestion to states, recently I worked with the Georgia State Energy Office for a grant that they were administering, and go with people within the networks that like do really good diligence on finding out who's working in these circles. And you'll find that most of the time it's the same people in each state. There's really like a less than 6 degrees of separation when you can find like some true community organizers that don't know everyone else that's working on these issues within the state. So like just do your diligence on understanding the landscape of your state, and then finding that even just that one community partner, and if they invite you to an event, or if they say come to this and come, then you're gonna, once you go to that event and you're present and you sit back and you listen, you're gonna meet so many other people who are in on the ground or out there running a lot of programs that support the work that you're trying to get to. So I would just say take the fear out of outreach, take the fear out of the outreach and you doing outreach yourself, and go and find out who these people are, who your aggregators are, who are the people within your community. And I'm telling you, if you just find one trusted source and you start building that trust, I may not know about sidewalks, but I go to the city and I find out like what's happening with the sidewalks in this community, and I go back and report something, so because then it's on me. If they brought it up to me, it's on me to at least give them an answer. I have to take that information and come back with it. So do that. Show that you actually do care and you're not just there to get your initiative completed. So building that trust is really hard, but the best way to build trust is to show up.
Agreed. I always ask some of the folks I work with to take a look at their LinkedIn network and see if you have any folks already in your network working in community. Many times we do not. We have not made those connections yet. When an opportunity presents itself, we think we can just pick up the phone and they're going to answer. These folks are busy, and many times the community-based organizations that immediately come to our mind come to a dozen other folks' minds too. They have a lot of people, organizations interested in partnering with them. And I think we sometimes forget, even organizations that have an energy focus likely have a varying kind of mission than ours. We have our goals, we have our outcomes we want. They're not always the same as the organizations we want to partner with. So how do we find common goals, making sure you're aligning your values and being very careful to not extract resources from these organizations. We are learning, we're growing, we want to partner, but what are you putting back into the community, into those community-based organizations so that they can sustain themselves? I was reading an article some time ago. It was actually some research done in the health industry, and it talked about how there could be real negative consequences from government and quasi-government entities coming in to work with community-based organizations, because we all want to work with community-based organizations. Why? We want to work with them because they're nimble, they've got boots on the ground, they have the pulse in the community, and we interject some of our policies and pull them away oftentimes from doing that very important work on why we engage with them in the first place. So I think we just have to be careful on how we engage and make sure that we are giving as much as we're receiving in these relationships. And I'm not just talking about Amazon gift cards, y'all. I mean real value into these organizations, helping to build capacity so they can go on and continue to scale and grow in any way that they think is appropriate.
And that's a part of that benefits that we talked about earlier. When you're sitting down and talking about a benefits plan, like sit down with them, and if they need capacity building, work with them on a 3-year strategic plan of how you're going to support maintaining the capacity at that organization. You can build that into a benefits plan. I just hopped on because I wanted to say that, yes, you forgot to say, because we have to work with them now because federal law requires that we have to work with them. So I think that the requirement part of that is what's pushing many people, many of these, whether they're state or federal agencies, to reach out to community and say, hey, we need you. But I mean, I see this all that they don't know who the people are. They have no clue of who to reach out to, which we can't blame them. This hasn't been their job to do that all these years. And now all of a sudden, they have to, flex that skill, and so they reach out to the folks that they know, and hope that those folks can also connect them to other people. But yeah, we have to work with community, which I think has been the best part of all of this work, is we're getting people to reimagine and rethink about what equity looks like within this work because of these laws, and I think that is so important.
Those answers were like poetry. Thank you, guys. Those were great best practices. Thank you. A lot of our attendees in the questions they submitted are curious about success stories. And I'm wondering, are there trusted partners that you've seen states reach out to, or local community or local governments reach out to, that you see as being leaders in the energy equity and engagement space that you'd point others to? Maybe there's a municipal utility or a CBO or a nonprofit, like someone who's doing good work in this space.
Many. There's a lot out there doing great work in this space from state to state. You can't, I won't pinpoint one particular state, but I will say, as Quinn mentioned earlier, like, let's not just focus on those larger community-based organizations that everybody goes to when they need something because they know that they're a larger organization. And what I'm finding with some of these larger organizations, and I'll admit, I've even done consulting for some of them because they didn't know, because they don't work in the energy space. They may work in community, they may be a large community-based organization that supports community work, but they have no idea about this energy landscape. And so then they bring in someone like me that knows the energy landscape that can actually help them and understand the language that's coming from the industry, and then know how to connect it to the community. But there's not focusing on some of those larger organizations. And I will tell you, communities actually like, that money's not trickling down to us. When you go to those larger organizations, it's not coming into the community where we actually need the support to do this work. They're just staying large and broad, and then we're staying small and still continuing to do our work and still doing all the things that we need to do to support our communities. But they're not coming to us. That money's not trickling down into communities. So those on the call, like, keep that in mind, that while you want to go to some of the bigger ones just because it's easier, a lot of times that money doesn't translate and doesn't transfer back into community in the way that you would like to see it, or you think that it may be going. But I've seen it happen many a times. There's some great organizations out there. I'll give you one experience that I can actually talk about now, as a process with EERE, with the Department of Energy. They were trying to bring in more HBCUs to apply for the HBCU prize. And they needed assistance getting the word out because they hadn't gotten enough applications in. So they reached out to myself and a couple other organizations that I know. And what I found that I had to do was actually pare down all of the information that they were sending out there and put it into a language where the folks that I'm sending it to, I know that they can understand, a quick, easy read. So I actually did that and sent it out. And gave it to the other two organizations that were working to get the word out. And they ended up having, twice the number of applicants than they had before. And so sometimes it's just getting that extra eye and that extra viewpoint on, we know that agencies a lot of times have to do things by the book, and that's legality for them. They have to put it all in a certain way. But then when they work with organizations like ours and they say, how can we help reach them? Like, first of all, no one's going to read, through all these pages. They want a quick snapshot, what they can understand, what they need to do. How do they go in and sign up for the application? Who do they need to partner with? And it's clear and simple. So they're getting better. They are getting better. I do work with a lot of them on streamlining their processes with some of these innovation prizes. And so they are getting better, but they still, you all have to really think about who's reading this material. Who do you really want to apply for this? Mm-hmm. And who's going to be reading that material? And is it truly, in fact, a simple process? I say that GEFA did an amazing job, the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority. They did an amazing job with streamlining the process and streamlining the application. But the outreach was where they needed really a lot of support on, because state energy offices typically don't go into communities and work. So, it's just really about developing those alliances and those partners who can really help you. And if they're in the mindset of really thinking about community, they're not going to be offended by you reaching out to them. We want to see community get this money. So if you reach out to me, I'm not offended that, oh, you came to me because you didn't have the connection. No, tell me what we need to do to get the community this money.
I would add that the success stories, I have a few, but the success stories have a few things in common, which I think are important to kind of creating more success stories. And one is going in without bias, particularly in disadvantaged communities, of who they are and what they want. I've heard some doozy things that people have said about kind of, oh, well, these people and this, and no, we are talking about ourselves, right? We are talking about, that's why I started with, we are the community. And so when you're thinking through what they want, what their priorities are, think about, what we would want in our priorities, right? And a lot of times you'll find that they're very similar, if not the same. But that second piece where I talked about the accountability is go in and listen. So the success stories have gone in to listen, and then up front with the communities worked on what the objectives are and how they are going to measure success. And I say that because sometimes within, particularly when we're talking about clean energy, some of the ways we may need to measure success, an example, Dr. Knock, who's a wonderful professor at Carnegie Mellon, has talked about this. Energy efficiency is an example of that, right? If you have people who are not using heat or not using air conditioning in the summer because they can afford it, if we improve their quality of lifestyle, energy efficiency is actually going to go down because they're using more, but we have actually improved quality of life, right? And so for us, that's a hard thing because we're looking at energy efficiency. Of course, we don't use this kilowatt hour. It's amazing. That's not necessarily the right approach. And so again, kind of the other piece of success stories is being willing to be flexible on what we would define success outside of that community we're going into. So kind of the idea of listening, the idea of setting objectives and measurements, and the idea of being flexible around what that success would look like. I think a lot of the stories I would think of carry those same themes.
And I guess just to, I think Damali's point is really important, and I don't want us to gloss over it. We need to be very clear on what success looks like, because the metric we're using to define success will directly impact the way we design and deliver programs. So if success is simply a very, quantitative metric of reduced energy, then we're only going to offer our products and services into homes and communities that we can see clearly that there will be a reduction in energy. Now, mind you, we all want to see efficient energy use. We all want to see reduction, but we know, and Damali mentioned Dr. Knock, there's science and statistics behind that. Folks that are experiencing limited incomes are likely not using energy in a way that's healthy or safe. So if we put folks in a position where they can be healthy and safe, will that result in an energy reduction or energy increase? I don't know. But if that's our single most important metric, then we may look like we did not succeed simply by looking at numbers. But you've improved quality of life, you've improved health, you've improved how people engage with energy, and those things are incredibly important too. So I urge you all to really think about what success looks like and be very clear on how you implement your programs based on that metric.
That's really powerful. Yeah, taking the presumptions out of that and taking beginner's mind and building from there with the community in mind when we define success. That's great. So Pam mentioned a bit about, burdens on the community and gave an example about the importance of making applications more streamlined and less burdensome. And I'm thinking about burdens in other spaces as well on the community. We want to make sure that when we're engaging the community and we're informing our programs and all of our analytical needs and administrative needs with the information they give us, and also when we're engaging the community, we're trying to, at the same time, give them meaningful authority in the decision-making process and in the leadership space. So we're trying to get information from them to build these programs, and we're also trying to give them responsibilities and decision-making. And we're trying to do all of that without being overly burdensome and exploiting the resources and the time and information that they give us. Those are pretty broad topics, but does anything come to mind in either of those spaces, receiving information and giving communities decision-making and leadership roles that you would recommend and provide best practices on to make sure that we're not overburdening them?
I will start and say, I think the first thing that we need to rethink is our perception of people who take advantage of programs such as SNAP or other housing voucher programs, as there's widespread fraud, right? When studies have been done to look at fraud in those programs, I saw one say it's less than 2%. If we look at I think there's still about $1 trillion of PPP loans that are missing and unaccounted for. And so when we think about that scale, we can start then again looking at things like self-attestation. There's not going to be, a lot of times people ask for help when it's too late, right? Like one of the things when you're working in the community and on the ground is that it takes a lot for people to acknowledge and raise their hand and say, hey, I'm having a problem, even more so when the problem is multifaceted. And so when we think about streamlining applications, when we think about streamlining programs, I remember I looked up as part of this, looking at just the common core application for colleges. And I am old enough that I had to apply to every single college and request the application in writing, and receive it via the postal mail, and then send it back out with copies of all of the materials. And there's several, over I think almost 1,000 colleges that participate in this common core application. And so when we believe that people are honest and we believe the perception of what people are applying for, we have models that we know that work. And so I think the first thing in this idea of removing burdens is taking away this bias towards people applying to these programs or doing that for a free handout. It's not that case. People are generally doing this as a measure of last resort. I live in DC. People are applying to housing voucher programs, for example, for safety reasons for their kids. When you talk to people who are doing that, it is never I want this from the government. It's, I want to move to some place where I can feel confident and raise my children in some place safe. And so taking that out, then that allows you flexibility again to think through what does it look like? What does being housing insecure look like, right? So there's a requirement, for example, that the lease and the utility bill match. Well, who are we now limiting, right? In different communities, so for example, I am on my father's utility bill, right? He is older, and for safety reasons, I have that. So if he had to apply for a program, it's now in my name. We've now already just created a barrier. And that happens so often, and so much more of things that we take for granted about thinking through the programs. One program in DC, everybody was required to have a physical copy of their Social Security card. And again, using my father as an example, I don't think he's seen his Social Security card since I was born. Right. And so he knows his number, he knows the information, but barriers like that, are just unnecessary, right? What's the validation? What are we looking at again? And when you start to look at the actual fraud numbers, when they do the audits, they're so low as to be de minimis.
Yeah, I know of at least one municipal utility, and I guess there's probably more out there that have removed the income qualification kind of process from their income qualified program. And they came to a conclusion that the fraud was so much internal administrative burden and burden on community to fill out the application, that the small percentage of folks that may fraudulently receive these benefits was low. So they decided to go ahead and remove that qualification from their process. And I'll have to check back up with them to see if they've seen any negative consequences. But I think we all should really consider, who are we keeping out of our programs by requiring information that may or may not be needed to provide benefit? Have all of you done an assessment of your application process? Have you had folks that actually be using these applications sit with it and give you some of their thoughts on, well, I don't even know where this number is. I don't know how to find that information. I have no transportation to get to an office to fill this out in person. I have no access to a notary. Like, there's so many different things that we include in some of these applications that folks simply don't have access to. I was doing a a focus group with some community-based organizations, and they had some fantastic advice and some really, upsetting stories of how benefits were being held from people that obviously needed them, obviously qualified, but they either couldn't make it into offices to sign documents, or they didn't have access to the internet to fill out, or even worse, you need an email address and to fill out some of these applications. They had no email address to do some of this work. So just be very cognizant of what you're asking for folks, and is it really required to provide the benefits that we're offering?
In communities, we have to also remember some historical context behind this as well. These communities are not trusting the government, whether local, state, or federal. They don't trust the government. You've got immigration communities who are afraid if the government comes in and gets information from them, then they're going to come and do a big sweep, immigration sweep. You have communities that feel like if I give you my information, then somehow you're going to come back to our community and use that information against me in some way. Like, communities do not trust federal, state, or local. They trust who they know. They trust who they know, and you have to get edified. The only way I get to work with a community in Tallahassee is if the community leader in Georgia that knows them edifies me and says, yes, she'll work with you and she'll do a good job, and they get to know you. You have to be edified. Community building takes a long time. It does not happen in 1 or 2 sittings. It does not happen overnight. Yes, they want to work with you. Yes, they want your money. They need your money. But you have to remember there are things happening in people's lives day to day to day. Making a process harder from them will be a detriment. I know if something is, I'm busy. I'm a busy entrepreneur. If it's going to take too much for me to do it, I'm probably not going to do it, and I'll just say I'll do it some other time, or I'll wait until it opens again because I just don't have the time right now. And imagine that you have a life where you're working possibly 6 to 12-hour days. You have children at home. You have multiple other constraints in your life, transportation. So you're on a bus or on taking the train for 2 hours out of that day. The last thing you're thinking about, and these are community members who run nonprofits. Many of them actually have full-time jobs as well. So keep that in mind too, that yes, they're working in their communities and doing this work, but many of them also have jobs that they have to work in order to support their families. And so just take the time out to really think about the situation. And I love how Damali keeps saying that we are the community. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. Until we start becoming more empathetic people and realizing that people, that we are humans and we've got lives and we have other things happening in our lives, and that includes the community members that you're talking to. Scheduling a call at noon to tell them about a webinar, to tell them about a product or a program, is probably not going to work because they're probably at work, likely. I have to schedule stuff at night. It might inconvenience me, but 7 o'clock at night is what works for the community. That's the best. Oh, I got a thumbs up on myself. But that's what works best for the community. It liked that one. So, I mean, you really have to think about other people's situations and be more empathetic to how life is happening for others when you're thinking about the processes and how you're pulling all of this together.
So great. Wow. It's good when even GoToWebinar agrees with you. Yes. Go ahead, Damali.
I'll quickly add a good litmus test that Quinn reminded me of is, could you do this at the library, right? If you don't, because don't presume people have laptops at home. And so could you do this focus session? Could you do this application? Like, would you feel comfortable doing all of that on a public computer at the public library? And if the answer to that is no, rethink your systems.
Yeah, and I think we have to look outside the box in general. I've heard some tactics that we don't generally execute on in this space, but we should really consider, such as, setting up shop with your applications at the multifamily community common space, or finding a partner where folks that are likely your target audience frequent more often. Set yourself up there and be available all day long to meet people exactly where they are. Has anyone thought about going to the local YMCA? You've got a captive group. I've been there watching ballet practice at 5 p.m. every evening. Sit down and have a conversation with folks about the benefits that you have to offer. We've got to kind of get out of that mindset that they're going to come to you. First of all, they don't even know who you are, what you offer, or what they're going to have to give you to get to it. And so let's find a space where we are meeting people where they are, even if that means on the evening at ballet practice.
And don't y'all see like the Verizon people and Sprint people outside the Walmarts all the time selling stuff, selling you phones or asking you to change your phone, or the AT&T, but you want to change your broadband? They meet people there, like this is where they know the people are going to be.
You know who's perfect at that? Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts know exactly where to meet you where you are. They get you coming in and coming out. So all of us have left with boxes of cookies, not knowing we needed them until we bought them.
Absolutely.
So,
Maybe states need to partner with Girl Scouts. I would.
Don't know. I
Not a
think those
bad idea.
I was a Girl Scout leader for those are some intuitive little girls. So I think so. They probably have some good ideas.
Good ideas. Oh, that's so great. Thank you all. And I want to pull on one of the threads that you mentioned, Quinn, just a moment ago, where you said communities that, how are they supposed to find you? How are they supposed to, take time out of their incredibly busy lives and find where you are? And I want to take a moment to consider things from the community's perspective, both because I think it would be helpful to community leaders and members on the line, but also for states to be thinking about it in this perspective too. How can communities go from, quote, being consulted on planning to actually being able to impact the plans? How can they find these programs? For those leaders that are trying to corral this effort and have it reach the individual people, what does that connection point look like for them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've thought about this so many different ways and so many times, because my natural inclination is to say, make the simplest communication you possibly can and put it in a place where people are looking. And I do think that will solve some of what we are trying to accomplish here. But what Pam has said many, many times, the trust factor is it's an intangible in that. Like, even if I have exposure to very well-written, concise information, if I don't trust you and what you're offering, it doesn't matter. So I think we need to do this work in parallel. I think we need to reduce our jargon, reduce the language to something that is very simple so anyone can read this and understand. I share this often. I read an article by the U.S. Department of Education that over half of the adults in this country will read below a 6th grade level. Tell me if anyone that is, can read at a 5th grade level will really understand some of the complex pieces of information we put out about these opportunities. So writing in plain language, putting it in places that people look, social media, infographics, things that are graphical, illustrative so people can understand, but partner with entities that add credibility. So we did some outreach here in Las Vegas. We called 2,000 companies, small businesses, trying to get them to tell us some things that they were interested in doing. We had more success with leveraging the chambers of commerce. Cold calling just wasn't the right way to go about it. Those organizations saw the chamber behind it. They're like, I know that organization supports us. If they say it's okay to go and have a conversation, then we're going to go. And it was wonderful. And we had some really robust, very informative conversations. So I think it's both getting to a point where you're communicating the way people understand in a place they'll actually read it, and collaborating and partnering with organizations that can get that message out to the folks you have no relationship with.
I would also add to that, partnering with other agencies, right? Like some of the challenges that we're having, like we have a very specific community ask, but Are we looking at partnering with our housing agency? How are they reaching out to communities and engaging with them? Like the people who are applying for, I talked about voucher programs, or people who are applying for different education programs, right? Are we looking even at the community organizations, but are we looking within our own state infrastructure to determine maybe your, state, local, county board of education has really good insight into parent groups and their communities and who they are. I fully understand schools have more data on families, and again, it can't be shared, but is that a way that you are looking, where we say show up? It is that thinking outside the box. Like, can we show up at a PTA? Can we show up when they are, at an after school program? Can we show up at places where we know that there are populations and people that we want to reach? And so thinking through that infrastructure, even at that state level, can also yield results.
And you can show up at an NPU meeting, a neighborhood planning meeting. I know we have those here in Georgia, but they're called other things across different states. You can show up at your city council meetings and hear what the communities are talking about, what are some of their big issues. And I love that idea, Damali, of partnering with other agencies and across agencies, because many of the housing authorities or the SNAP programs or Peach program, whatever you want to call them, have a lot of the data, one, and then sometimes they also have those relationships with community-based organizations already, because they're relying on them to get data as well. And so it reminds me of a workforce program that I was working on, and I didn't realize that the SNAP program for that state offered free paid funding for upskilling. So at the local community college, they actually paid for that for students or for young people who had previously been on SNAP. They could go in and go to technical school for free. Pairing that with a workforce program, who knew? That was even available. That right there, can be a way that you're also looking at how can we build our program out? How can we make it more substantial for a community? Add that workforce element to it that's already kind of offered free for some folks that they may not even know about. So it is the communication part. It's also just going and showing up and being there. But you gotta show up. Please don't expect anyone to do this work for you. They've got to get to know the intent behind it, and you've got to get someone to kind of edify the work for you in community and bring you in, sort of say, just for them to be able to trust you, because trust is really a major factor. Trust is a major factor, and it is crippling to a lot of our communities. And if you look at some of these community leaders and folks who have been doing this work for a long time, I mean, if we talk a little bit about the environmental justice movement, the environmental justice movement was bred out of the civil rights movement. So when you have a lot of EJ leaders and folks who are in community that have been fighting for their communities for a very long time, most of them are older folks. Most of them are older. So most of them have been doing this a long time, and they were doing this back in the 50s and 60s when we as a people, in particular Black people, were not treated well by the government. They remember that. So it's hard for them to think about anything when corporations come around. The same corporations that want to do well in their community now polluted in their community before. They don't trust them. So it's really about having an intermediary, someone come in that can explain like how things are going, what the program looks like get them to ease up a little bit and trust this process. This is a lot of money coming in at once, and people want it, and they want to help their communities, but they're still very untrusting. So we really have to just keep that in mind as we're going through this process. Again, having that empathetic lens and bringing that human element to it is really going to take you a long way.
Thank you. And to highlight and underline the trust component and how that takes time. It doesn't come from showing up once in your community and being like, okay, I did it, check. Since that takes so much time, and is something that is worth building toward to actually get the results that we want in these communities and that the communities want. A lot of states have expressed nerves and frustration around the timing of a lot of these funding programs and how quickly they need to be deployed and how quickly we need to get engagement and input, and then the money's out and we're on to the next one. So how do you recommend that states balance those two things in the rush environment of these programs and make sure that they have meaningful stakeholder engagement for these programs, but that they're building trust in the long term?
That's when you get your edifier. I'm sorry, go ahead, Quinn.
We have to stop starting to engage when an opportunity presents itself, right? Like, I think we see something like, oh my gosh, we need to engage with this community. We run out and think, well, I reached out, I didn't hear from them, or I tried and we didn't get the engagement we wanted, because we should have been doing this 6 months, a year ago, 2 years ago. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, or like Pam said, just because you have one engagement. It takes time. And we need to have a plan. We're an industry of planners. We know what we need to do. We need to plan our engagement the same way. When there's going to be events, activities, you know that these community organizations need some support, be there first. So when you come to them 6 months down the line saying, we need your help, they remember, they recall that you were there for them, that you helped provide a space for them to have an event, or you helped sponsor some type of event that they were having. They remember these things, and it shows you're investing in them. So let's start earlier and not wait until an opportunity presents itself.
Good point. And I've actually had to do that with a couple of communities that I've been working with. And while I've been working with them for 3 months, an opportunity came up and it was like, hey, I know we've been doing all this great connecting, but we've got to get to business because this thing opens and closes in a very short amount of time. So I actually had to really pause the engagement piece, but I asked them. So I said, listen, we're going to do more of this. We haven't even started our community benefits plan. You know why? Because we hadn't had enough time. We've just been getting to the very beginning of the engagement cycle. And so, but I was like, hey, but there's this opportunity. And I asked them, do you want to do this? Because we have to act on it fast. It's not going to stop any of our engagement. We're going to continue to engage after this. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to continue to engage after this, but I'd like to see you all get some of this funding, and the application process is fairly easy. And I think that we can get some of this funding to do some of the things that we talked about. So let them make the decision on if they want to proceed with going after the money, or if let's just keep things as it is because we're still trying to get to know you. There's going to be other opportunities for things later. So, you know, but ask them what they want to see and what they want to do. And they might surprise you and say, yeah, let's go ahead and go after it. And then we'll pick back up. So, you know, always give the community the opportunity to make their own choice in what they want to do. And then I would say for those who have a program that's coming out really quick and they've got to get quick response on it, that's when you try to find that trusted partner that already has the community's ear that you can go to. Find that trusted partner.
Oh, I think we're at time, but I will add to that. In addition to that, particularly if you do have a timeline, transparency and accountability, right? I think going to when you're speaking, you know, think of it as dating, or think of it as a study group, right? When you had study groups in college or grad school, the way you got along was being transparent. And so if you do have timelines and say, look, hey guys, I know we didn't build this relationship. I know that you have, like, acknowledging all of the past harms and acknowledging where you are and saying, we have a deadline, we would like to support, we know that you don't have a reason to trust us. Then set some milestones, right? Set some ways that you will report back to the community. Set some ways you are going to hold yourself accountable. Set some ways that the community can then hold you accountable, so that they can say, okay, you know, maybe we'll try it this time. But that will give people, one, the ability to come back and build that trust, right? Trust is built and broken when you don't do what you said you were going to do. And allow for some of the areas that again, money's coming out, and they're not, deadlines that are not movable, right? And so being honest and open about that while keeping it simple. Again, it's just highlighting some of the themes that we've heard. We've heard a lot about meeting people where they are, keeping it very simple. Simple does not mean dumbing it down. Simple means really explaining it to them for the benefits of where things are, right? I know I've been in this industry for years. It took me a very long time to understand capacity markets, right, in a wholesale market. That's not because it's just simple. You have to keep it simple. Also, that idea of being transparent and upfront, and that idea of partnership, right? And that idea of partnership comes back to removing our own biases and saying, okay, we are open to what you tell us that you want.
Wow, what excellent points to leave us off with, and values and best practices to go forward in our work with. Thank you all so much for agreeing to be a part of this webinar panel. There were so many good questions and conversations that we didn't get to, conversations around compensating communities, multifamily rentals, community benefits plans. And I'm wondering, perhaps there's an opportunity in the future to discuss with our panelists again, if they'd be so kind to join us again. There's just so many questions, and this work is so important and is at the heart of everything that we are meant to be doing going forward. So I just want to thank you all again. There's so much gratitude being expressed in the question and answers for you all being here. And yes, there will be a recording of this that will be posted on the website. Thank you all. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day and weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.